Hello, I'm Toycat, and I can't believe it's actually real, but this Gulf has now been renamed, and it has two names if you live in any non-American country, because the White House declared it to be Gulf of America Day and signed an executive order more or less forcing American companies to refer to it as such. This might be great for the US domestic market, but meanwhile, in the rest of the world, big things are happening, especially in the South Pacific region. So these are the Cook Islands, and officially they are a part of free association with New Zealand, so you might treat them as New Zealand in a lot of ways, but they are their own independent country, and they've just signed a new deal with China. In fact, this new deal they've signed with China has actually put them at odds with New Zealand, because New Zealand describes it as a dispute. Officially speaking, they are meant to consult New Zealand on any of these matters before doing them, and they failed to do so, presumably because they assume that New Zealand wouldn't like it. This is a very, very interesting move, because they haven't actually really identified anywhere what this deal is. They've officially said the deal is to achieve new progress, but the only actual details we have as a theory is that maybe some mining of valuable minerals is going to be a part of it, and so China is looking to basically buy some rights to some minerals in this country. And this is a very interesting move for a place that is, what you might describe as very much part of the non-China movement in the region, but it is something that China is getting better and better at. This is one of their forms of diplomacy, which is very much a great return for China, because you might have heard about the resurgence in China aid to the Pacific that has really been going down recently. It's something they were doing pre-pandemic, it's something they're now doing again post-pandemic, and they'll single out a country, such as the capital of the Solomon Islands here, and they'll say, yeah, why don't you get some lovely school upgrades, new roads and government vehicles so that you can improve your capital, and all you have to do, just one little favor for us, is obviously be a bit friendly of us, but as we're friends here anyway, maybe you could stop recognizing those silly Taiwanese people. If you're not familiar, there are two Chinas in the world. You're only allowed to recognize one, and even though that's true, and all countries in orange only recognize the PRC, the People's Republic of China, China if you will, a lot of countries are in this darker color where they unofficially recognize Taiwan, because they just have some relations with this weird island that happens to have its own governance, and so, effectively, China says, yeah, if you could shift from being one of these weird beige countries into this deeper orange, we could give you a bit of money. And it's a really great deal for China, because slowly but surely they are buying influence across countries which are, fairly cheap to buy if you think about their influence. I mean, if we look at the actual amount of funding that it would cost to be on their side, Australia spent $1.5 billion in aid for the region, which is very high. The US spent $249 million, while China spends $256 million. That is actually an incredibly low amount to get enough foreign aid to make countries go, yeah, let's change our entire foreign policy decision on this one issue, because worldwide it's a big deal about whether China recognizes Taiwan or vice versa, whether Taiwan gets to be independent. But if you're out here in the South Pacific, you probably have bigger concerns, which is one of the reasons why it is so concerning to the rest of the world. So yeah, China is I think this is one of the reasons that I think it's very interesting to talk about what's going down with the US and China, because China is one of the countries the US is targeting, but it seems to be very, very, very low down on the list. Again, everyone has already done the whole we're attacking China thing, and so domestically there's not a lot of gain in doing that much to China, so they have a very low 10% tariff, while meanwhile they're looking at the rest of their allies and saying, what if we went for a 25% tariff? The US is announcing a 25% tariff for all steel and aluminum imports. I know, by the way, as a British person, I should say aluminium, but because it's America, they would call it an aluminum import tax, and so I'll roll with it for the sake of this video. But the aluminum going into the United States is going to be tariffed, and even the tariff exception for Australia is being under consideration. Except that's what Australia would say is like, oh, don't worry, they're going to give us an exemption just like they did last time. Except then what Trump says is, a short time afterwards, he's like, oh no, there'll be no exceptions, and then saying, yeah, but I'll consider this one exemption, but like no exemptions or exceptions. In other words, even though Australia is meeting all of the requirements for the United States, like by having a trade surplus, in other words, the US is robbing Australia by, Mr. Trump's logic, but even though that's happening, no. We're going for this tariff on everyone. Sorry about that one. Good luck, guys. And so while the US is basically shunning its closest allies in the region, China is saying, yeah, we're not really that bothered about anything. We could open up more trade if you feel like it, but we could also just, hand you a bit of money. You want a few $1 million here or there? And that is something that is fascinating. In fact, if you are trying to think about the world as a businessman, and I think a lot of business people are in key government positions right now, including, interestingly, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. He used to be the, I think this is wild, he's the old CEO of Air New Zealand from 2012 to 2019. I feel like an airline CEO is not, CEOs in government, not a terrible decision. Airline CEOs, I'm not so sure about that one, but yeah, he won a very, very decent vote share at the last election, is currently the leader of the government, and is a great example of how, businessmen and government can lead to all sorts of great things, but it's worth mentioning that treating the world like it is business can lead to some small problems. For one, unlike maybe like businesses, you could say, you can actually grow better together by lowering everything for everyone. And I think the problem around the world is that there are lots of relationships that are worth buying, even though they are bad deals. And one of my favorite examples of this has to be Taiwan. Taiwan, if we go back to this map right here, actually buys all sorts of, maybe buys is the wrong word, but where China is trying to buy influence over here, and Taiwan also has to basically compete with them, Taiwan also has bought influence in a surprising number of countries in the Western Hemisphere. And my favorite example is I just went to St. Kitts, and I was only there for most of a day, but while I was in St. Kitts and Nevis, which is basically, you could describe it as the smallest real country. There's like 2 islands that aren't really, countries in their own rights. There's 5 micro countries in Europe, but the lowest population of a real country is St. Kitts. And in St. Kitts, again, it's a very, very small place, but they have, you might find notable, an embassy of the Republic of China. That's Taiwan if you're not familiar, but there is a Taiwanese embassy in St. Kitts, and all this costs them is a few $100,000 in funding for some eco parks and for building the embassy, a very lovely one here, adding to the legitimacy. It is very, very wild to me that this is the ROC Republic of Taiwan embassy for St. Kitts, because this is one of the countries which is fairly cheap to compete in, basically. You can try and buy the favor of major countries in the world, or you can buy the favor of fairly small ones for a significantly smaller sum, and this is kind of the interesting balance between how China kind of needs to see the world, because they want the whole world to be, effectively China needs to see the world through UN seats or through sovereignty. They need as many sovereign nations and as much supportive leaders as they can, partially for the sake of getting more trade and partially for the sake of looking like they're doing the right thing, whereas the United States, as the world's largest economy, effectively can have the luxury of saying, if you want to grow our economy and have better things happening here, 90% of global trade happens in the biggest 20 economies. It's probably a lot closer to 80. But the idea of 80% of the trade happening in 20% of the places is a very, very normal thing. But if you just keep good relations with these countries, the big 5 in Europe, plus Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Brazil, Australia, Indonesia, a few Asian countries, and you're good, right? Wow, it's very, very easy. Except unlike China, which is strategically seeing, this is what I'm saying. The US gets to see the world like this. You have a few security partners where you think it makes sense to keep trade going, but mostly you want to have great trading relations with as many of these countries as possible, whereas China has to see the world like this, where you want to have as good relations with as many of these countries as possible, because every single seat counts, every single UN vote counts. That's a very interesting difference in how you have to view the world, but even more interestingly is the fact that within their worldview, China is slowly but surely making inroads to making sure more countries will eventually see their invasion of their land over here as legitimate. While China is doing their job just great, the United States kind of isn't, right? I would say that if you want to have the most trade, you could argue that you can do it self-sufficiently. This is one of Trump's big points, and I think a really interesting article from the BBC here was about how Trump has clarified exactly where his opinions have come from. He had a tremendous amount of respect for Japan, but then he watched with jealousy as Japanese businessmen were viewed as geniuses and were able to just invest and buy up huge amounts of American and particularly New York property. And one of the reasons he felt they could do that was that America was assisting Japan with their military defense. In other words, America was spending money to protect Japan. Don't look into the reason why that is. It goes way back to World War II, let's say. But America sends money to Japan, and America opens up their market to Japan. Well, the same isn't really true in reverse. Indeed, he felt like the other countries were ripping off the United States, because as a foreigner, good luck trying to buy property in Japan. It's fully legal to do so. There are some countries that ban it. I think weirdly, actually, New Zealand is on that list. There's a heavy tax, or it might be an outright ban on non-residents buying property. But in Japan, any foreigner can buy property. They are an open market, thankfully speaking. However, good luck getting any finance from a Japanese bank, and good luck having the applications go smoothly if you're not a Japanese person. And so the argument is that the whole thing about this trade deficit and this partnership has come from the logic of, the US sees, or rather, Mr. Man in charge of the US sees, other countries as being like Japan, as having non-trade barriers to entering the countries. And so the only way to fix that is by saying, okay, we're going to make a pretty big trade barrier to you entering ours. Is that a good move for the United States? Again, I think there is a big question mark around the world of like, is this the end of free trade, or is this just like a 4-year pause on making it any better? But while the US is doing their 4-year pause on building better relations with their allies, like you might expect, again, threatening to tariff or tariffing every single one of his closest allies, and crucially, every single one of the big economies which you need to be friends with. I don't think he's made a threat towards Turkey yet, to be fair, or Saudi Arabia, or India. I don't think he's done anything with India yet. So I think he's got at least 4 allies secure. Maybe the hardest 4 allies, you could argue. Ultimately, while the US is threatening its closest allies, the people it probably needs to be on side and wants to have being like, oh yeah, buying American is fun, and selling to America is a great time. Having bilateral trade with these nations is wonderful. While the United States is kind of struggling with what is its place in the world, should it go back to being an isolationist and saying, yep, anything from outside of America isn't worth dealing with? Because while America is doing that, its biggest rival on the global stage is doing a pretty good job. China has more influence not just across the South Pacific, but also in countries like Mauritius. I think the situation in Mauritius is absolutely crazy on a lot of levels. You might have heard about what's going down with the UK selling this territory, but there is a lot of this thing of the world is always in flux. The world is always looking for someone to point towards, and more countries are going, especially within China's sphere of influence, are saying, oh, I guess it's China then at least, because as much as we don't like the way they do their politics over there, they are at least pretty stable about it. Whereas you can be fairly sure that in the same way that America has flip-flopped in the last 12 years, an ungodly number of times, it's starting to be seen as a weakness rather than a strength. And I don't know how you deal with that within a democratic system, besides saying that slow change is better than fast change, but that sucks on a domestic level. So what do you reckon is my question. Do you think that, the big global question here is, do you think it is a good thing that the US is taking a step back on the global stage, or do you actually think that, is that like a good sign for the world to like let it make its own decisions in more of a way? Because I think that there is a real argument you could say that like, why is it? If the US is spending $249 million here, and then still getting much worse than the China is getting for 256, maybe there should be no funding until something better is agreed. Or maybe you could say that actually the fact that we don't know what the US is getting out of its money in the region is a good sign. The fact that when you see the Solomon Islands being like, oh yeah, we really do not believe in Taiwan, that's not a real country, you know exactly they've been bought and paid for that. Is it a good thing that we don't know what US money does? I guess that's the interesting question that you can never have a good answer to, but the only thing we can answer is that this area has 2 names now, and isn't that fun? Isn't that such a good thing for the world? Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you found it interesting, because I'll see you next time. Nah, I won't. Also, if you enjoy these geopolitical daily dives, consider supporting on Patreon, link down below. Unlike most places that like hide the amounts that come from it, I'll let you know exactly how many strange beverages and kebabs and lobster rolls I get with your money. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed, because I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.